There's a sentence broke people repeat to themselves almost every day, and it has nothing to do with money. It sounds so reasonable, so mature, that most of them never notice they're saying it at all. Not until the day they realize it's the exact sentence that kept them broke for 20 years. I didn't find this by studying millionaires this time. I found it by doing the opposite, sitting across from people who worked just as hard, wanted it just as badly, and still watched every real opportunity slip through their hands. Different jobs, different cities, different excuses on the surface. Underneath, the same 5 things, repeated so quietly that most of them would deny doing any of it if you asked them straight to their face. You've probably done at least one of these 5 things this week, maybe this morning. By the middle of this video, you'll know exactly which one has been running your life without your permission, and what that discovery is about to cost the version of you who keeps ignoring it. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let me tell you what I was not looking for. I wasn't looking for lazy people. I wasn't looking for people who slept until noon or blew every paycheck on things they didn't need. That story is easy to tell, and it's mostly a lie. A comfortable one, because it lets everyone else off the hook. The truth I actually found was harder to sit with. Most of the people I spoke with worked hard. Some of them worked exhausting hours, year after year, doing everything they'd been told to do. And somehow the number in their account never moved. Not really, no matter how many extra shifts they picked up or how many times they promised themselves this year would be different. So I stopped asking what they were doing wrong on the outside, the resume, the budget, the job title, and started paying attention to something quieter. What they said to themselves when nobody was listening. What they did in the 10 minutes after something went badly. What they let other people talk them out of, and how easily. A man who'd been passed over for the same promotion 3 times told me, almost as a throwaway line, that he'd actually turned down a better offer 2 years earlier because it felt too risky at the time. He said it the way you'd mention the weather. No weight to it at all. But I noticed he circled back to that decision twice more over the course of our conversation, unprompted, like a tongue returning to a sore tooth. He wasn't over it. He'd just trained himself to talk about it like he was. A woman working 2 jobs to keep her apartment told me, when I asked what she pictured for her life in 5 years, that she didn't really let herself think that far ahead anymore. Not because she lacked imagination. Because the last 3 times she'd let herself picture something better, life had taken it away, and she'd decided somewhere along the line that hoping was just a more elegant way of setting herself up to get hurt. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think a version of it lives in more people than would ever admit it out loud. Here's where this connects to something Napoleon Hill spent an enormous amount of his working life documenting. He didn't only study the men and women who built fortunes. He studied failure just as closely, interviewing people who'd had every reasonable chance at success and still ended up with nothing to show for it. And the conclusion he came back to, again and again, wasn't about opportunity or talent or even effort. It was about fear, specifically what he called the fear of poverty, which he considered the most destructive and the most deeply rooted of what he identified as 6 basic fears working against the average person. Not fear as a single dramatic moment of panic. Fear as a low, constant hum sitting underneath decisions that look, from the outside, like caution. What makes that fear so effective at keeping a person exactly where they are is that it rarely announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as being realistic, as playing it safe, as responsibility. You don't take the risk because you're being sensible, not because you're afraid. Except sensible decisions and fear-driven decisions can look identical from the outside, and only one person in the room actually knows which one is steering. There's a concept from modern psychology that sits right next to this without contradicting a word of it. Researchers who study chronic stress have found that a nervous system exposed to repeated financial strain doesn't just feel worse. It starts making decisions differently, favoring the immediate and the certain over the larger and the delayed, even when the larger option is objectively better. Scarcity doesn't just take your money. It narrows your attention until survival is the only thing your mind has room to consider, which means the very condition of being broke makes it harder to think your way out of being broke, unless you catch the pattern and interrupt it on purpose. I watched this play out with a level of consistency that honestly unsettled me the more interviews I did. Not one grand failure. 5 small, repeatable things, done quietly, day after day, by people who would have told you, and genuinely believed, that they wanted a different life more than almost anything. The first one is the easiest to miss, because on the surface it looks less like a flaw and more like a virtue. The first thing broke people can't stop doing is this. They keep reopening decisions they already made. Not in some obvious, self-destructive way. Nobody sits down and decides to sabotage themselves on purpose. It's quieter than that, and far more common. They decide to start saving, and 3 weeks later they're negotiating with themselves about why this particular week is an exception. They decide to leave a job that's been draining them for years, and then spend the next 18 months relitigating the same decision every Sunday night, arriving at the same conclusion, doing nothing different on Monday morning. The decision gets made. It just never gets to stay made. I sat with a man who'd been about to start a side business for 4 years. 4 years is a long time to be about to do anything. He wasn't confused about what he wanted. He could describe it to me in more detail than most people describe things they've actually built. What he didn't have was a decision that held its shape once Tuesday's rent was due, or once his brother-in-law made an offhand comment about how risky it sounded, or once a bad week made the whole idea feel foolish again. Every setback reopened the file. Every conversation with a skeptical relative reopened the file. The decision he'd supposedly made was really just an idea he kept auditioning, over and over, never actually cast. Napoleon Hill had a word for the condition underneath this, and it wasn't laziness. He called it drifting. Moving through life without a definite purpose firmly fixed in mind, letting circumstance, other people's opinions, and the mood of the day steer decisions that should have been settled once and left alone. He was blunt about what drifting costs a person over time, describing it as one of the surest paths to a life spent wishing instead of building. The drifter isn't someone doing nothing. Often they're doing quite a lot. Working, worrying, planning, starting things. What they're not doing is finishing the internal argument. The decision stays open, indefinitely, silently draining energy that should have gone toward acting on it. Here's what makes this particular habit so hard to notice in your own life. It doesn't feel like failure while it's happening. Relitigating a decision feels responsible. It feels like diligence, like taking the choice seriously instead of being reckless with it. But there's a difference between genuinely gathering new information and simply refusing to let a settled question stay settled. And the second one wears the costume of the first so convincingly that most people can't tell which one they're actually doing. Psychologists who study decision fatigue have found something that lines up with this almost exactly. Every open decision you're carrying draws down a limited daily reserve of mental energy, whether or not you're actively thinking about it in a given moment. You felt this yourself, probably without naming it. The strange tiredness at the end of a day where you didn't do anything physically demanding, just carried 5 or 6 unresolved questions around in the back of your mind from morning until night. A decision you make once and let stay made costs you that energy exactly once. A decision you keep reopening bills you for it every single day it stays open, sometimes for years, and you never even see the invoice. I think about the man auditioning his own business idea for 4 years, and what strikes me now isn't that he lacked the ability to build it. Everything he described to me, the product, the customers, the pricing, was sound. What he lacked was the willingness to close the file and accept the discomfort of being wrong if it turned out that way, rather than the much smaller, quieter discomfort of simply never finding out. Staying undecided felt safer. It also meant that 4 years later, he'd paid the exact same price as failing, minus the chance that it might have worked. There's a particular moment I want you to notice this coming week, because I think you'll recognize it the instant it happens. It's the moment right after you've decided something, really decided, not just leaned toward it, and a small voice starts asking whether you're sure. Notice what you do with that voice. Most people mistake it for wisdom. Often, it's just the old habit, looking for the door back in. The second thing broke people can't stop doing lives right next to this one. And it's even quieter, because it doesn't happen in moments of decision at all. It happens in the ordinary, unremarkable minutes when they think no one, including themselves, is paying attention. The second thing broke people can't stop doing is talking to themselves in a very specific way, without ever noticing they're doing it at all. I don't mean the obvious kind of negative talk, the dramatic, "I'm a failure" moment after something goes badly wrong. That happens to everyone occasionally, wealthy or not, and it usually passes. I mean something smaller and far more dangerous, because it's disguised as personality instead of belief. "I'm just not good with money. That's not really how my luck works." People like us don't get those kinds of breaks. Said lightly, said as a joke, sometimes, with a small laugh attached to soften it. Said so often, over so many years, that it stopped sounding like an opinion a long time ago and started sounding like a fact about the weather. A woman I spoke with, a hospital administrative assistant working 2 jobs, told me, almost proudly, in the way people are sometimes proud of a wound they've carried so long it's become part of their identity, that money just doesn't stick to her. She said it the way you describe a family trait, like being tall or being allergic to something. When I asked how long she'd believed that about herself, she thought about it for a moment and said probably since she was a teenager, watching her mother struggle with the same thing, saying the same words. Here's what should unsettle you about that sentence, and I want to be precise about why. She wasn't describing a pattern she'd observed. She was reciting a conclusion she'd already reached decades earlier, and then living inside it so completely that she'd stopped noticing it was a belief at all rather than a law of nature. Napoleon Hill built one of the central ideas in his work around exactly this mechanism, and it's worth understanding precisely, because most people only ever hear the shallow version of it. He called it autosuggestion, the principle that your subconscious mind accepts and acts on whatever thought you feed it with enough repetition and enough real feeling behind it, whether that thought serves you or destroys you. He was explicit that this operates in both directions with equal force. The subconscious doesn't grade the instructions you give it for quality. It doesn't ask whether "money doesn't stick to me" is a fair description of your life. It simply accepts a sentence repeated often enough, with real emotion attached, and gets to work making it true, filtering your attention, shaping your choices, quietly steering you toward evidence that confirms what you've already told it to believe. Which means every time that hospital assistant said, "Money just doesn't stick to me," lightly, as a joke, she wasn't describing her situation. She was issuing an instruction, and her mind, faithfully, had been following it for years. Modern psychology has its own name for a piece of this same territory. Researchers who study rumination and what's sometimes called learned helplessness have found that repeated exposure to setbacks a person believes they can't control doesn't just produce sadness. It produces a specific kind of passive resignation that generalizes far beyond the original problem, coloring decisions in areas of life that were never actually affected by the original setback at all. One bad financial year becomes, "I'm bad with money." One failed attempt becomes, "I'm not the kind of person this happens for." The sentence outlives the situation that created it by years, sometimes by an entire lifetime, quietly running in the background of every decision that follows. I want to be fair to something here, because it matters. This isn't about forcing a fake smile onto a real problem, or pretending a difficult financial situation isn't difficult. Hill was never describing wishful thinking dressed up as strategy. He was describing something more demanding than that, the discipline of choosing deliberately and repeatedly which sentence you're going to feed your own mind about who you are and what you're capable of, rather than accepting whatever sentence showed up first and never questioning where it came from. Here's what I want you to do right now, before the next block starts, because I think it will matter more than it sounds like it should. Think of the sentence you say about yourself and money, the one that comes out easily, almost automatically, maybe even with a small laugh attached the way that hospital assistants did. You know the one. If you're ready to stop feeding your mind that instruction and start feeding it a different one, type "I am ready" in the comments right now. Not as a slogan, as the first repetition of a new sentence, the one you're choosing on purpose, in front of other people, in a moment you didn't have to make public, but chose to anyway. I read every one, and the version of you who writes that today is already a half step ahead of the version who scrolls past it saying nothing. The third thing broke people can't stop doing is telling everyone. Not their plans, their problems. There's a particular kind of person you've probably met, maybe without ever naming what you were looking at. The first thing out of their mouth, almost every conversation, is what went wrong. The boss who's impossible. The bill that came in higher than expected. The system that's rigged against people like them. And here's the part that took me a long time to see clearly, because on the surface it looks like venting, which everyone needs sometimes, and looks almost harmless. It isn't harmless. It's a habit that's quietly running the same direction every single time, and it's rarely pointed at solving anything at all. I sat with a man in his 40s who could describe, in vivid, almost entertaining detail, exactly why his industry had screwed him, why his last 3 employers had been unreasonable, why the whole economy was stacked against a guy like him. He was funny about it, genuinely funny, the kind of storyteller who has a room laughing within 30 seconds. And I noticed something as he talked. Every story ended in the same place. Him, wronged, blameless, and the world at fault. Not once, across almost 2 hours, did the story shift into what he was going to do about any of it. The story wasn't building toward a plan. The story was the plan. Telling it, well, to a sympathetic audience, had become the entire activity. I don't think he was lying about any of it, and that's important. The boss probably was unreasonable. The economy probably had made things harder. What I noticed wasn't dishonesty. It was where his energy actually went. Every retelling gave him something real. The warmth of being understood, the relief of an audience nodding along, agreeing that yes, it really wasn't fair. That relief felt like progress. It wasn't. It was a substitute for progress, and a comfortable one, because sympathy is so much easier to collect than results. Napoleon Hill wrote extensively about the danger of exposing an unformed plan to the wrong kind of attention, and he was specific about why. Every person you tell your struggle to, especially the ones who respond with agreement rather than useful counsel, reinforces the story exactly as it currently stands. Sympathy feels supportive in the moment. What it actually does, more often than not, is confirm the version of events where you're a bystander to your own life rather than the author of it, and confirmation, repeated often enough across enough conversations, hardens into identity. He warned people directly against sharing a struggling plan with those who'd meet it with pity or doubt instead of genuine, constructive thought, precisely because the wrong kind of company doesn't just fail to help. It actively feeds the exact story keeping a person stuck. There's a term in psychology for a specific version of this: co-rumination, the excessive, repeated discussion of problems between people, circling the same difficulty again and again without ever moving toward resolution. Researchers studying it have found something almost paradoxical. It deepens the bond between the people doing it, because there's real, genuine closeness in being understood. And at the same time, it tends to deepen the very distress it's supposedly relieving, because talking about a problem repeatedly, without acting on it, keeps the nervous system rehearsing helplessness rather than resolution. The conversation feels like release. Physiologically, it often functions closer to reinforcement. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling you to go silent, to stop confiding in the people who love you, to perform strength you don't feel. That's a different trap, and it isn't a healthy one either. What I watched separate the man with the funny, well-worn stories from the people building something real wasn't whether they ever talked about their struggles. It was who they told, how often, and what they were actually looking for when they opened their mouth to say it. Comfort, on repeat, from anyone who'll offer it, or counsel, occasionally, from someone who might actually move the story forward. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. The last time you told someone about a setback, were you looking for a way through it? Or were you looking for someone to agree that it wasn't your fault? Both are human. Only one of them changes anything. The fourth thing broke people can't stop doing is the one that costs the most, because it doesn't happen during the struggle at all. It happens at the exact moment the struggle was about to end. There's a story Napoleon Hill told about a man named R.U. Darby, and I want to tell it to you the way he told it, because nothing I could invent would land harder than what actually happened. Darby's uncle caught gold fever during the Western Gold Rush, staked a claim, and started digging. Weeks in, he struck a vein of, or rich enough that he needed outside money just to buy the equipment to keep going. He brought in relatives, bought machinery, and the early results were extraordinary. Enough gold coming out of that shaft to make every one of them believe they'd found the one that would set the whole family up for life. And then, without warning, the vein disappeared. They kept drilling, chasing it in every direction they could think of, and found nothing. Eventually, exhausted and out of ideas, they gave up. They sold the machinery to a junk dealer for next to nothing and went home. The junk dealer, before doing anything else, brought in a mining engineer to take a look at the operation he'd just bought for pennies. The engineer studied the geology and told him something the Darby family had never bothered to find out. The vein hadn't vanished. It had faulted, shifted sideways underground the way veins sometimes do, and his calculations put it almost exactly 3 feet from the spot where Darby's crew had stopped drilling. 3 feet. The junk dealer resumed digging at that precise location and found the vein again almost immediately, going on to make millions from the very mine the Darby family had walked away from, convinced there was nothing left to find. I want you to actually picture that moment before I tell you why it matters. Not the millions afterward, the moment before. A tired, discouraged group of men, standing in a hole in the ground, having done everything they knew how to do, staring at rock that showed no sign of what was 3 feet beneath their boots. From where they stood, quitting wasn't recklessness. It was the only reasonable conclusion available to them. That's what makes this story so uncomfortable to sit with, rather than simply inspiring. The decision to stop wasn't stupid. It was, by every piece of information they had in that moment, correct. And it was still the single most expensive decision of their lives. Here, finally, is the thing I promised you at the start of this video, the pattern sitting underneath every single one of the things we've covered so far. It isn't really about decisions, or self-talk, or who you tell your problems to, or when you quit. Every one of those is the same habit wearing a different disguise, letting the feeling of the present moment, discouragement, doubt, exhaustion, fear, make decisions that should have been settled in advance, on a calmer day, by a version of you who could actually see the whole picture instead of just the 3 feet directly in front of your boots. The broke person doesn't lack effort. The Darby family worked themselves nearly to the bone. What they lacked was a decision made before the exhaustion arrived about how they'd respond once it did, and so exhaustion, when it showed up, got to make the call instead of them. Hill was direct about what he took from this story, and it's worth hearing exactly, because it's more specific than simple perseverance for its own sake. He wasn't telling people to dig forever, blindly, no matter what. He was pointing at something narrower, that most people give up at the exact moment right before a breakthrough, because they have no way of knowing, in that moment, how close they actually are. The tragedy isn't quitting. Everyone quits something eventually, and sometimes correctly. The tragedy is quitting without ever finding out what those last 3 feet were hiding, and spending years afterward wondering. There's research on persistence and grit that circles this same territory from a different angle, distinguishing between people who quit strategically because new information genuinely changed the picture, and people who quit reactively, in the grip of a hard moment, using the feeling of that moment as if it were data about the actual odds. Those two kinds of quitting look identical from the outside. Only one of them is a decision. The other is a mood, mistaken for a decision, and acted on as if it were permanent. I think about the exact spot those men stopped digging more than almost anything else in this story. Not because 3 feet is a small distance, though it is. Because nobody put up a marker. Nobody could see it. The only thing separating them from the rest of their lives was a number none of them would ever know, unless somebody else, with fresh eyes and no memory of how tired the digging had been, came along and kept going. The fifth thing broke people can't stop doing is quieter than all 4 of these combined, and it's the reason the first 4 keep happening at all. The fifth thing broke people can't stop doing is this. They keep the promises everyone else can see, and break the ones only they will ever know about. It shows up so small you'd almost miss it if you weren't looking for it directly. The alarm set for 5:30, silenced at 5:31, with a private, reasonable-sounding negotiation happening in the half-dark. Just this once, I'll make it up tomorrow. The budget written out carefully on a Sunday night, abandoned by Wednesday for a purchase that felt urgent in the moment and forgettable a day later. The goal stated with real conviction. I'm going to start applying for better jobs this month. Quietly not started, week after week, with no one ever checking, because no one else was ever going to. None of these moments look like much on their own. That's exactly what makes them so effective at building the life they build. Nobody's life falls apart from one broken promise to themselves. It erodes from thousands of them, spread out over years, each one so minor it never seemed worth defending. I sat with a man who described his own mornings to me with a kind of pained honesty I didn't expect. He said he'd made the same promise to himself probably 400 times. Get up early. Use the quiet hour before the house woke up to work on the thing he actually wanted to build. He could tell me, almost to the week, how long every single attempt had lasted before it quietly dissolved. What struck me wasn't the failure itself. Plenty of people fail at a new routine. What struck me was how casually he'd come to expect it from himself, the way you'd expect rain during a certain season. He wasn't shocked when he broke the promise anymore. He'd stopped being shocked years earlier, and that, more than anything, was the actual problem. Here's what's happening underneath that, and it's more consequential than a missed hour of work. Every time you make a promise to yourself and quietly let it slide, you're not just losing that hour. You're gathering evidence, real, lived evidence, filed away somewhere your conscious mind barely notices, that your own word doesn't hold much weight. And your mind takes that evidence seriously. It has to. It's watching you the same way it watches everyone else, forming an honest opinion based on what you actually do rather than what you say you intend to do. Psychologists have a name for the confidence a person has in their own ability to follow through on what they set out to do, self-efficacy, and it isn't built from motivation or good intentions. It's built almost entirely from a track record, accumulated one small kept or broken promise at a time, whether or not anyone else was ever watching. This connects directly to something Hill placed near the center of everything he taught, even though he rarely phrased it in these exact terms. He described self-mastery, the discipline of directing your own thoughts and actions on purpose, rather than being directed by mood, comfort, or the pull of the easiest available option in any given moment, as the foundation underneath every other principle he ever wrote about. Not a moral virtue for its own sake. A practical requirement. A person who cannot govern their own small daily behavior has no real mechanism for governing the large decisions that supposedly matter more, because the same undisciplined hand is on the wheel either way, at every scale, all the time. The man with the 400 broken mornings wasn't lazy in any way that would be visible to a stranger. He held down a steady job. He showed up for his kids. He kept every promise that came with a witness. But in the one arena where the only witness was himself, the standard quietly dropped, over and over, until dropping it stopped even registering as a decision. It had simply become who he was, not because he lacked the capacity to be otherwise, but because he'd never noticed that the capacity was being spent somewhere else entirely. I want you to think about the last promise you made only to yourself. Not the one you announced to your family, not the one with a deadline someone else is tracking. The quiet one. The one where breaking it costs you nothing except the fact you now know about yourself, whether you admit it out loud or not. That's all 5. And I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now, because I thought the same thing the first time someone laid all this out in front of me. You might be thinking, isn't this just another way of blaming people for being poor? Doesn't this let the real forces off the hook? The unequal starting lines, the industries that vanish overnight, the medical bill that arrives out of nowhere and erases years of careful saving in a single afternoon? I want to answer that honestly, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve a tidy message that makes me sound wiser than I am. Those forces are real. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the playing field is level, because it isn't, and pretending otherwise would insult everyone who's ever watched a genuinely unfair thing happen to them or someone they love. Some people start with resources others will never see in a lifetime. Some people get sick at exactly the wrong moment. Some industries collapse through no fault of the people inside them, taking careers with them that took 20 years to build. All of that is true, and none of the 5 things we've talked about pretend it isn't. Here's the distinction I need you to hold on to, because it's the difference between this actually helping you and this just becoming one more thing to feel bad about. These 5 things aren't why anyone becomes broke in the first place. Bad luck does that. Bad timing does that. An unfair system does that, plenty of the time. What these 5 things do is something narrower and, in a way, more important. They're why so many people stay there long after the original circumstance that put them there has passed. The layoff is a fact. Reopening the decision to look for work every single week for 2 years is a habit. The medical bill is a fact. The sentence, "Money just doesn't stick to people like me," repeated for a decade afterward, is a habit. The unfairness explains the fall. It doesn't explain staying down for 20 years after the ground stopped moving. Psychologists describe something called locus of control, essentially, whether a person tends to believe the outcomes in their life are driven mainly by their own actions or mainly by outside forces they can't influence. People with a stronger internal locus of control aren't naturally luckier, and they don't face fewer setbacks than anyone else. What tends to differ is what they do the week after the setback lands. Not because they're in denial about what happened to them, because they've drawn a line, consciously, between the part of the story that was done to them and the part of the story still waiting for them to write it. I think about a woman I met near the end of this project, briefly, almost as a footnote to everything else. Someone who'd lost a job in a round of layoffs that had nothing to do with her performance, in an industry that simply stopped needing as many people as it used to. Genuinely, completely unfair. What she told me stayed with me. She said she gave herself exactly 1 week to be furious about it. No apologies, no rush to feel better before she was ready. And then, on the Monday after that week ended, she picked one of the 5 things we've covered. The decision she kept reopening about whether to retrain for a different field entirely, and she closed it. Not because the anger wasn't justified, because she decided, in advance, how long she was willing to let something she didn't control keep controlling what happened next. That's the whole distinction, really. Nobody's asking you to feel grateful for an unfair situation or to pretend the deck wasn't stacked in some specific way against you. What separates the people who eventually climb out from the people who don't usually isn't the size of the unfairness they faced. It's how long they let it keep making decisions on their behalf after the actual event was already over. There's something I haven't told you yet, And I think it's time I did, because it would be strange to talk to you this honestly about all 5 of these things without admitting how many of them I've done myself. Before I ever sat across from any of the people I've told you about tonight, I spent almost 3 years doing at least 4 of these 5 things without knowing I had names for any of them. I'd taken a job I didn't want, in a field I'd more or less fallen into out of convenience rather than choice, and I told myself for a long time that leaving it was something I was seriously considering. The way you tell yourself you're seriously considering something you have no actual intention of doing anything about yet. I reopened that decision more times than I could count. Every few months, something would happen. A bad week, an unkind email from a manager, a moment of watching someone else build something that felt more alive than what I was doing, and I'd feel the pull all over again. Promise myself this was the year, and then let the feeling pass without acting on it. The way you let a wave pass over you at the beach without actually moving your feet. I had a sentence too, one I didn't even recognize as a sentence at the time. I used to tell people, half joking, that I wasn't really the entrepreneurial type, that some people were built for taking risks and I was built for showing up reliably and letting other people take the risks. I said it so often that it stopped sounding like a decision I'd made about myself and started sounding like a fact I was simply reporting, the same way you'd report your height. I didn't realize until much later that I was the one who'd installed that sentence, and I was the one repeating it, faithfully, on a schedule. And I told people, not my plans, I didn't have any yet, not really. I told people my complaints, the job that wasn't fulfilling, the manager who didn't see my potential, the industry that didn't reward the things I thought I was good at. I got very good at telling that story, the same way the man with the funny stories had gotten good at his. People were sympathetic. It felt like being understood. It also meant that for almost 3 years, the conversation never once moved past the complaint, because I'd never given it anywhere else to go. The night that actually changed something wasn't dramatic, and I want to be honest with you about that too, because I think a lot of people are waiting for a dramatic night that may never arrive, and using its absence as a reason to keep waiting. It was an ordinary Thursday. I was sitting at my kitchen table with the lights already off in the rest of the house, doing the math on what it would actually cost to give myself 6 serious months at something I actually wanted to build, instead of the version I'd been quietly abandoning every few months for 3 years running. The number scared me. It wasn't a good number. There was no clean, comfortable path from where I was sitting to where I said I wanted to be, and some part of me wanted, very badly, to close the laptop and reopen the whole question one more time, the way I'd reopened it a dozen times before. I didn't have a perfect quote from Hill waiting in my head that fixed everything in that moment, and I won't pretend I did. What I had was smaller. I remembered the man with 400 broken mornings, the one I hadn't even interviewed yet at that point. That came later, but I already knew a version of him, because I was him. And I asked myself one honest question at that kitchen table. Was I going to keep being a person who reopened this decision every few months for the rest of my life? Or was I going to close it tonight, badly, imperfectly, with no guarantee it would work? I closed it, not with confidence, with a kind of grim, quiet resolve that had almost nothing to do with feeling ready. The fear didn't go anywhere that night, and it hasn't fully gone anywhere since. What changed was smaller than a feeling. It was a closed file, sitting where an open one used to be, and a version of myself who no longer got to relitigate the question every time a hard week showed up. If any of what I've described tonight sounds like your own kitchen table, at your own hour, I'm not going to tell you the fear disappears once you decide. It doesn't. What I can tell you is what actually starts to change once you close the file, and exactly how to begin doing that with each of these 5 things, starting tonight, before whatever brought you to this video has a chance to fade. Start with the first thing, because like the last video I made, it's the one that costs you nothing to begin except the discomfort of finally choosing. Find the decision you've been carrying the longest. You already know which one. It surfaced somewhere in the last few minutes whether you wanted it to or not, and close it tonight. Not research it again. not wait for one more sign that never quite arrives. Decide. The way the woman who lost her job decided on the Monday after her week of anger ended, and then tell one other person. So the decision exists somewhere outside the privacy of your own head, where it's harder to quietly walk it back. The second thing follows almost immediately, and it costs even less. Notice the sentence. The one you say about yourself and money that comes out easily, almost automatically, maybe with a small laugh attached to make it sound lighter than it is. You can't replace what you haven't noticed, so the first job is simply catching it out loud, in real time, the next time it slips past your lips. Once you catch it, you don't need an elaborate new mantra. One honest, specific sentence, repeated in a moment that was already going to happen anyway. Brushing your teeth, driving the same road you drive every day, is enough to start building a different instruction where the old one used to sit unquestioned. The third thing asks you to look honestly at who's on the other end of your hardest conversations. You don't need to go silent, and you don't need to cut people out of your life. You need to ask yourself, the next time you feel the pull to tell someone what's going wrong, whether you're reaching for counsel or reaching for comfort. Both have their place. The trouble starts when comfort is all you ever ask for, because comfort, taken on repeat, starts to feel like the whole solution instead of a brief rest along the way to one. The fourth thing is harder, because it asks you to make a decision in advance about a moment that hasn't happened yet. The moment you're exhausted, doubting everything, standing in a version of that hole in the ground with no way of knowing how many feet of rock are left. Decide now, before that moment arrives, what would actually justify stopping. Not a feeling, a fact. New information that genuinely changes the picture. Not just fatigue borrowing the voice of wisdom to talk you out of something a calmer version of you already committed to. Write that standard down if you have to. The Darby family had no such standard. They let the exhaustion of one bad stretch make a permanent decision, and they never knew, for the rest of their lives, exactly what it had cost them. The fifth thing is the quietest and, in a strange way, the most immediate. Pick one promise you make only to yourself, small, unglamorous, something nobody else will ever check on, and keep it today. Not a grand overhaul of your entire life, starting Monday. One kept promise, today, with no audience, no reward, and no one who would ever know if you'd broken it instead. That single kept promise won't fix anything on its own, but it's the first entry in a different ledger, and your own mind is reading that ledger far more closely than you probably realize, deciding, based on exactly this kind of evidence, what kind of person it's dealing with, and what it's therefore willing to help you build next. None of these 5 things will feel dramatic while you're doing them. I want to be honest with you about that, one more time, because I think the drama is exactly what most people are secretly waiting for before they'll start. Some clear, unmistakable sign that this is the moment everything changes. That sign rarely comes before the change. Usually, it only becomes visible looking backward, the way it became visible for a man I haven't finished telling you about yet, standing in the wreckage of a family gold mine that had just made someone else rich, 3 feet from where his own family had stopped digging. I told you about the mine, but I never told you what happened to the young man who watched it happen. Darby's nephew, the one who was actually standing in that hole in the ground, watching his family's entire investment get sold off to a junk dealer for almost nothing. I wanted you to sit with the loss on its own first, without the ending softening it too early. Now I think you're ready for the rest of it. That young man didn't forget what he'd watched. He carried it with him, the way you carry the memory of a specific mistake that costs you something you can never fully calculate, because you'll spend the rest of your life not knowing exactly how much it cost. Years later, he went into selling life insurance, a business built almost entirely on being told no, over and over, by people who have every polite reason in the world to turn you away without a second thought. Most people in that line of work don't last. The rejection wears them down long before any real success has a chance to arrive, and they quietly drift into something else, telling themselves it just wasn't the right fit. He didn't drift. Every time a prospect turned him down, he told himself the same thing, deliberately, on purpose, the way you'd recite an old lesson you'd paid an unbearable price to learn. He was not going to stop 3 feet from gold again. Not this time. A no wasn't a verdict on the account he'd never open. It was rock that hadn't cracked yet, and he'd already decided, long before any particular conversation went badly, that rock cracking slowly wasn't the same thing as rock with nothing behind it. He kept working the account. He kept asking the follow-up question. He treated resistance as information to work with, not as a signal to pack up and go home the way his own family once had. He went on to become one of the most successful life insurance salesmen of his time, in an industry that quietly buries almost everyone who enters it. And by his own account, every bit of that success traced back to a single afternoon standing in a hole in the ground, watching his family's fortune get sold for scrap to a stranger who was about to become rich from the exact spot they'd abandoned. I think about that particular kind of transformation more than almost anything else in this story, because it isn't really about the mine at all, not by the end. The mine was the tuition. What he actually walked away with wasn't gold. His family never got a cent of that gold. Not $1 of it ever came back to them. What he walked away with was a rule he never broke again, forged in the specific, humiliating memory of having broken it once, publicly, expensively, in front of everyone who mattered to him. That's the part one want to leave sitting with you before we close. Most of the worst moments in your life aren't only losses. They're also, if you're willing to actually look at them instead of flinching away, the most expensive tuition you'll ever pay for a lesson you'll need for the rest of your life. The Darby family's mine never came back, but the man who watched it disappear turned that exact loss into the discipline that built everything that came afterward, not despite the humiliation of walking away too early once, but because of it, examined honestly instead of buried. You don't get to choose whether you'll have a moment like that one. Almost everyone does, eventually, in some form. What you get to choose is what you do with it afterward, whether it becomes a story you tell for sympathy at dinner parties for the next 20 years, or a rule you never break again. I told you at the beginning of this video that there's a sentence broke people repeat to themselves almost every day, one that sounds so reasonable most of them never notice they're saying it. I never told you what that sentence actually is, because I wanted you to find it yourself, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, in your own voice, rather than have me hand it to you like a diagnosis. Maybe you found it in the decision you keep reopening. Maybe it was hiding in the joke you make about money not sticking to people like you. Maybe it showed up in a conversation you had this week, one where you were looking for comfort and calling it something else. However it found you, I think you already know which one it was, and I don't need to say it out loud for both of us to know that you heard it. 5 things. A decision that never gets to stay decided. A sentence, repeated so often it stopped sounding like an opinion. A story told for sympathy instead of a plan built for progress. A stopping point chosen by exhaustion instead of by you, in advance, on a calmer day. A promise, made only to yourself, broken so quietly that no one ever had the chance to hold you to it, including, most of the time, you. If you walk away from this video treating those 5 as a checklist to fix by Friday, I think you'll have missed the actual thing underneath them. What all 5 are really describing is smaller than 5 separate habits and harder than any one of them alone. It's whether you're willing to let a bad moment write the ending of your story, or whether you're willing to write it yourself, in advance, on the days when writing it is easy, so that it's already written by the time the hard days arrive to test it. The Darby family's mine is still there, somewhere, in whatever's left of that stretch of land. Nobody remembers their names the way people remember what was found 3 feet from where they stopped. That's not a cruel detail. It's just what happens when a decision gets made by exhaustion instead of by intention. The story moves on, and it moves on without you, whether or not you were the one who deserved to be standing there when the gold finally came up. Napoleon Hill spent the last years of his working life insisting that real wealth was never only the number sitting in an account, that a person could die with a fortune and still have been poor in every way that actually mattered, or build something modest and be genuinely rich, depending entirely on what they'd done with their own mind along the way. I understand that sentence differently now than I did the first time I read it. I understand it as the difference between the Darby family and the man who kept digging in a different direction entirely, not the ground, but himself, one refused excuse at a time, for the rest of his working life. You're not broke because you lack what it takes. Every person in this video started exactly where you're starting, with a mind full of the same 5 habits running quietly in the background, mostly invisible, mostly unnamed, until somebody finally said them out loud. Somewhere in your life right now, there's probably a version of that hole in the ground. Maybe it's a decision you've reopened so many times you've lost count. Maybe it's a job, a relationship with money, a version of yourself you keep almost becoming and then quietly setting back down. I don't know your exact version of it, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I only know, after everything I've told you tonight, that almost everyone building something worth building eventually stands at the edge of one, tired, uncertain, holding a shovel that suddenly feels heavier than it did this morning. I can't tell you how many feet are left beneath where you're standing. Nobody can, not really, not even the people who eventually find out. What I can tell you is that the distance matters less than what you decide it means while you're still the one holding the shovel. That decision doesn't belong to tomorrow, once things feel steadier. It doesn't belong to some more capable version of you who shows up later, once the fear has quieted down enough to make room for it. It belongs to whichever ordinary hour you happen to be in right now, shovel in hand, deciding. Their name now. What you do with that is the only part of this story I can't write for you. Somewhere tonight, 3 feet under a decision you've been avoiding, there's something waiting that you haven't found yet. Not because it isn't there, but because nobody's told you, until now, how close you actually might be. If tonight was the night one of these 5 things finally got a name, follow the channel before you close this, because there's more of this waiting for the nights you need it again. And if you know 5 people still standing in their own hole in the ground, wondering whether it's time to stop digging, send this to them. You might be the reason one of them keeps going.